Hello, I'm Christian Holmes, the CEO of Caba, the occupational charity for chartered accountants. A recent survey looked at the pressures on chartered accountants through the cost of living crisis. We've assembled a panel to look at some of the challenges that are presented and some of the solutions that are on hand. Paul Day is one of Caba's senior support officers. He has been a specialist debt advisor for the charity for over 10 years. Kirsty Lilly is an award-winning mental health trainer, coach and mindfulness facilitator. Mark Pearce is Caba's Head of Service Delivery and Development and holds a wealth of experience in health and social care, having previously worked for the UK's National Health Service, as well as not-for-profit organisations and social housing groups. Tuba Siddiqui is a qualified chartered accountant. She will be sharing her first-hand experience of working in the industry, as well as insights from her volunteer work. Let's face it, who is better placed to understand the challenges other members might be facing right now than a chartered accountant? Paul, why is the cost of living going up?
So I think it's important firstly to define what we mean by the cost of living, and that is the amount of money needed to cover everyday essentials such as food, energy and fuel. And there's a number of factors that are contributing to this, certainly global factors. There's been an increased amount of demand after the pandemic. We've seen conditions affecting supply chains and crop yields. And of course, also the awful situation in Ukraine has had a profound impact as well. And I think it's important to note that these are all extraordinary global events. So nobody is immune to this situation, no matter what position they're in.
Mark, why is the economic crisis so problematic for our mental, physical and financial health?
I think it's an interesting point, Chris, but globally we've been through a number of difficult times. So we've had the pandemic, we've been through lockdown, we've kind of got the cost of living crisis hitting us, we've got recession being talked about, we can see what's happening in the environment, and this begins to impact on everybody's sort of mental health. Impacting mental health can impact physical health. And what we are seeing is that we are seeing more requests for help around different areas that we have done before. So specifically on emotional support, we are now seeing some more distinct types of requests for emotional support. So self-harm, eating disorders, the kind of culmination of emotional impact of what we've been through beginning to play out, and we're seeing it across family members, across working professions, across older people, so it's beginning to impact across. It's a feeling of inadequacy, that we're unable to cope with a wide range of factors, and that feeling of inadequacy begins to play out in terms of our requests, in terms of our feeling of well-being, and impacts across a lot of emotional and also physical health, because physical health also becomes impacted when we are choosing between some really difficult conversations around, and we've seen it in the media at the moment, do you choose food or heating? And where you're making difficult choices and across a family, that begins to impact quite heavily.
So I think also in terms of mental health, there's lots of evidence to suggest that when we feel financially compromised, that it really takes an effect on our mental health, because it's quite stressful for people. You know, our financial security gives us this ability to provide ourselves with our basic needs for shelter, food, water, light. And when that is compromised, it's really stressful for people and they feel psychologically unsafe, and it's something that's playing on their mind all the time, understandably. And I think it's also stressful for people when they're not able to provide what they normally did for their family, a standard of living that perhaps they've become used to. And I think the other thing, that the double whammy really, is that when our finances are compromised, we're not able to do the things that actually support our well-being, the hobbies that we enjoy, the things that we find pleasurable, going out with family and friends, they're also challenged. And people can start to experience feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and a sense of entrapment, especially, as Paul said, that a lot of the reasons that we're in this position are of a geopolitical nature that we individually can do very little about. So people do feel as though they're losing control of their own agency in these type of situations.
Thank you, Kirsty.
I think people can be very resilient. I think people have, after what we've been through with the pandemic in recent years, people had to be more and more resilient. But I think it's fair to say that the current situation does present a very real concern for people's personal finances. And I think particularly with our audience, with accountants, I think the professional reputation is so important, and I think it's tied in with a person's self-worth and identity. And I think being in financial difficulties, experiencing those problems, I think it has an impact on people's self-worth as well.
Thank you. Tuba, from our community, what's been your experience?
With the stress of not just this cost of living crisis, but pre this, we had the COVID. That already led a lot of people to be in a position where they were already very stressed out by the conditions, which has only worsened with this cost of living crisis. And I think I look at it holistically. I look at it from both the problems, and together I agree with the point that it affects someone's self-worth, especially with accountants, which is associated with knowing, your finances and knowing your numbers, and which it really is not all what it is. So I think it just creates double the pressure.
Thank you. Paul, on a more practical footing, in relation to debt distress, what advice can you give people about managing that particular problem?
Absolutely, Chris. I think first and foremost people should look to prioritise their debts, because when you're in that debt position and there are so many different bills requiring your attention, demanding to be paid, it can be very difficult to know which are your priorities. So in debt advice we have what we call priority debts and we have what are called non-priority debts. Now that's not to imply that non-priority debts should be ignored either. It just means the first debts to tackle should be the priority debts. So what do we mean when we say priority debt? We mean a debt where if it isn't paid, the ultimate sanctions would be a loss of something essential to you. So that would be something like if you didn't pay your rent or your mortgage, you might potentially lose your home. If you didn't pay your utility bills, you might potentially be disconnected. If you didn't pay your council tax bill, you might potentially face a loss of liberty. So these are the debts that should be focused on first. Whereas the non-priority debts tend to be things like credit cards, loans, overdrafts. And sometimes people fall into a bit of a trap of focusing on these debts because often they attract charges and interest, but also because they shout the loudest as well. So it is important to remember to focus on the priority debts first.
That's a pragmatic and quite useful framework to help people manage through what must be quite a difficult situation. What would be the implications of not servicing a debt?
I think I've already sort of touched upon what the sanctions and the consequences might be. I think one particular consequence or challenge, I think it's the impact on you as a person, on your mental health and your well-being. I think many people in debt potentially try to avoid the issue because it is a scary and a big thing, and there are a lot of misconceptions about debt. And I think the important thing to think about in all of this is you and how it's impacting on you. And I would just encourage anybody in this position just to reach out to Caba or another debt advice charity for help and support.
Paul, we've talked about some of the personal implications and professional implications of managing debt and the cost of living crisis and how it affects us all. Would you encourage somebody to approach their employer?
Yes, I think so. I think it's worth noting that certainly historically there has been something of a stigma around being in financial difficulty, particularly of course in this profession where that professional reputation is very, very precious. But I think it's worth reflecting that being an accountant does not make you immune from these global pressures that we talked about earlier in the discussion. And I think it's probably important to note that your manager is also quite likely feeling pressures and their friends and families are also feeling pressure. So I think the more conversations we can have about this sort of topic, the more open and honest we can be, I think it's a step in the right direction. And we are certainly seeing this more and more, certainly over the past 5 years, the past 10 years. More and more employers are becoming switched on to financial well-being. And although there's certainly a long way to go yet before all of that stigma, that taboo is removed, I think we are making good progress. But I also think another important point is that you should only have that dialogue if you feel comfortable in having it. And I think there should be an onus on employers, on line managers, to make their employees feel empowered, feel supported, feel comfortable, creating that psychologically safe environment where people can talk about these potentially very, very sensitive subjects.
You would expect the organisation to give an emotionally intelligent response to quite a sensitive situation.
Yes, well said.
Is there anything else we can do, or any more encouragement we can give people to have these, what would be quite difficult first conversations?
I think just calling back to what I said about that professional reputation, you can be a fantastic accountant, really, really one of the top in your field, but you are not immune to these situations that we talked about, these wider global events. And I think it's also quite important to try to uncouple that from their own personal lives, because we know that people are doing this professional level, highly detailed, highly task-orientated work that requires a lot of focus, a lot of brain power as well. So I think it's just really, really important for people to feel that support and encouragement. And I think as well, we tend to live a little bit quite insularly, I would say, within our own minds. And I think if we can start to feel more comfortable in actually saying, I need a bit of support here, I'm finding it difficult, I'm finding it a challenge, having those conversations, reaching out, before people are at the point where they're facing burnout at work, or perhaps challenges, depression, anxiety, stress in their own personal lives as well.
Thank you. Mark, these aren't conversations that employers will have had with their staff over the recent years. Why should employers care?
It's about the health and well-being of their employees, and it's really important that the employee is in a good state of mind and able to turn up to work and do their job. And so we do have a duty of care to employees.
Line managers are people too.
Absolutely.
What would we be asking for employers in this situation?
It's about regular communication. It's about having lots of reassuring conversations. You can see what's out there. We talked earlier about there potentially being a recession. Usually we talk about recession, prices rising. I think even yesterday there was something around sort of work turning heating off. We need to be having communication and reassurance that actually we are keeping the heating on. We're not expecting you to turn up with your sleeping bags and kind of keep yourself warm at work. You need to be talking and recognising what people are being fed in terms of the main news media, and giving some reassurance that actually it's a safe space to have a conversation, your job's not at risk. And that reassurance really at really difficult times where people are thinking, can I afford my electricity? Can I afford my mortgage? Bills and costs are going up. The last thing they need is to be fearful that their work environment is crumbling around them. And sometimes it's also in the questions we ask. So I think Paul touched on it there. The ability just to say, how are things? Is everything okay? Being open in conversations about actually rising costs and the impact it's having on people. So we've seen a lot of sort of flexible working and hybrid models. What's the impact of that? Are you now going to be coming into the office to avoid heating your home? We need to be having conversations that recognise that there is a bombardment of information and a very changing front, and we need to make sure that we're offering some form of support and encouraging people to speak. And I think the first thing for me is sometimes just getting that initial conversation, because if you can say to someone, I'm struggling, you've opened the door and you begin to find your way through the maze of what it is that you're struggling with and the solutions. And what we find, and certainly Paul would be able to talk about this, is actually once you start that conversation, we often find that we can put in place quite a few things for people, because it might just start with actually I'm financially worried, and then it turns into actually I've got an emotional distress around that financial, and there's a lot of linkage that initial conversation, and we always encourage people, take that first step, because actually it won't be as bad as you think. It's not going to be judgment, it's not going to be anything else. So I think there is that role of just being clear in communication, extending what you can to offer support. So whether it might be if you're in a position to offer pay rises to staff to sort of keep up with inflation, if not one-off payments some employers have done. There was something today that certain employers are providing meals for their staff. So it's offering maybe some things that employers haven't thought of before, just to make it a little bit easier. And actually by doing that, you make a very fair process in terms of everybody can have a free meal. It doesn't feel like it's here, have a voucher, off you go. You've got a special need. It's applicable to everyone. And I think that removes some of the stigma as well.
We tend to place a lot of pressure within the individual, even the way we talk about mental health. But we need to remember that our mental health is affected greatly by the things that happen to us, the resources we have at any one time, the relationships we have around us. And as well as encouraging people to speak up, I think organisations, employers need to make sure that line managers feel comfortable and confident enough to have these type of really sensitive conversations and respond in a way that's compassionate, because not every line manager feels very comfortable with that, and they'll also have their own pressures, and they're often in the middle of the organisational culture and then managing the people in their team. So, you know, as well as talking about mental health and ensuring that people are confident and competent to have those discussions around something else that doesn't discriminate either, as Paul was saying, financial problems don't discriminate, and all of us can be at risk of poor mental health given circumstances. So really investing in your line manager population and equipping them with the skills they need, whether it be by training or other forms of learning, so that they feel confident not to wait for employees to come to them, but also to take opportunities in development reviews or one-to-ones, that they can actually inquire to someone, you know, how have you been lately? Is there anything that you're struggling with? And I think that builds up a sense of social cohesion in the workplace, and people feel cared for. And I think that's what people need at the moment, as well as, you know, the practical support.
So we're encouraged to bring our whole selves to work, and we talk about our conversations around mental health, and we should be in those conversations talking about financial health as well, and the same skill sets presumably apply.
Yeah, I mean, these are all sensitive conversations, and we've already talked about the great stigma that accountants might feel because it's about money, but the situations causing these difficulties are beyond any individual control, and there are many people in a very similar position. So, and also recognising that the more distressed we are, the less able we are to perform well, the less able we are to function, and it just goes round in an ever decreasing circle. So it's really beneficial for everybody that we start these conversations early. Yeah.
I think one thing I would say is the first step is recognising it. When we say the word employer, there's a lot of pressure, I think, in the mind that's already built up, because you're thinking of the company you work for, but actually it's the people you work for. And I think it's, if you invest in your relationship, again, coming back to the line of the person you're directly reporting to, building that rapport, building that relationship and bringing your true self to work, you can forget that it's your employer you're asking.
Yeah, and I think it's also helpful to remember that when you approach someone, you don't have to tell them everything about your situation. You can give some thought to the conversation, the main points you want to get across, tell people what's relevant for them to know, so that you have this sense of keeping some kind of control over this situation. And then, you know, giving people some ideas of what you think might be helpful for you is another good way. And sometimes we speak to people and they don't always have the answers that we assume they have. So giving them some steer really in terms of this is what I would find helpful, and can we negotiate a way forward?
It's also, I think, just in addition to that, is empowering somebody to be able to take those steps. So actually pointing them in the right direction. It's quite empowering if they felt they're in control of that situation and in control of some of the outcomes. Now, we recognise within what we do that we can't always do that, but if we can give somebody the key to open the door and take control, it is very empowering and does give them ownership of the situation, which I think is really important.
And I think just to start small, if you have financial issues or it comes back to the same issues we had when we had COVID. We had, you know, do we work from home? Do we go to the office? If we go to the office, how many times do we go to the office? It's similar type of conversations. You start small, get the ball rolling. You don't have to go out and say, I have financial issues. You can just start small.
Thank you. And to support that, Caba exists. So if you're uncomfortable having a conversation in the workplace or with your line manager, whether it's around psychological support or financial support, then colleagues like Paul or yourself are here. And we do strive to create that safe space.
Absolutely. I think it'd be really important for any line manager to know there is no expectation or pressure on you to deliver this, you know, this debt advice, to deliver this therapies and counselling. And as you very correctly said, Chris, there is Caba, of course, to draw on for members, students and their families. But also we appreciate that not all employees will be members, and it's useful to have other signposting resources. So, for example, for debt, there are wonderful free resources such as National Debtline and Citizens Advice out there, or even just a signpost to something like their GP if you can see they are struggling with their mental health as well. I think that's something really important for a good manager to have in their toolkit.
I think it's also worthwhile saying that when you mentioned Caba, I was thinking that it's not associated with your professional qualification. So even if you do go to Caba for help or support or assistance, or just, you know, you have a 24-hour line, so you can just say whatever you want to say any time of the day, I think that is not going to go beyond that channel. And I think it's just reminding, or I mean, Caba does a lot to remind others, but I think just reminding more that there is this safe haven. You can say your piece and it's like it's never happened.
And I think just in addition to that, we have had a number of cases, certainly as we've given help and assistance to people, they might approach us. So we did a kind of back to school program where we were helping people with some school uniforms, and a number of conversations we might have had, which is quite a small end conversation, began to grow because we actually helped somebody, and then that conversation took us somewhere else, and meant that person ended up really approaching us for a very small grant that was there to support them, but then opened a number of doors because there was a safe space for that conversation to take place. And for us, we're not sitting in judgment, we don't know individuals, it's about practical help and solutions that we can get to somebody as quickly as possible, because an intervention at an early stage goes a long way, as opposed to somebody going further down the, financial debt spirals, mental health spirals, physical health begins to impact, career health is impacted. So actually, if we can get an intervention in at a really nice juncture, and it's approachable and it feels right, then actually we are enabling people to not get into that spiral and to take some ownership.
I think it's also a practical step that line managers can take straight away in terms of familiarising themselves with what's available for staff and making sure that at any opportunity they distribute that information. So many times I go into organisations that have an employee assistance programme, they have a financial helpline, they have a career helpline, and yet none of the employees within the organisation know about that, because these are things that we generally access when times are problematic, so we don't often tell anybody else that we've accessed them. And a really quick practical step that a manager could do is to just spend a couple of minutes gathering the information necessary. What is the phone number for Caba, what is their email address, what is their website, what do we have available at work, so that if you get into these conversations, at least you feel empowered to give someone something that they can take away and explore themselves in that first conversation. And I think that helps to build trust, rather than saying, oh, I'll get back to you when I've done some investigation. Yeah.
I think that's really useful advice. And I guess a lot of organisations like Caba have been evolving the services and the support that they can offer. Caba, with its cost of living campaign, its winter fuel payments, its back to school campaigns, there will be more support available than there traditionally was. So it's important to educate yourself and point people where you can in the right direction.
Absolutely. I think as well, with many people, sort of older members, when they qualified, Caba was a very different beast. And I think it's probably important to be aware that, as Mark alluded to, we have tried to change and evolve with the times. You know, it is obviously traditionally a benevolent charity set up in Victorian times, but we all do take the current crises, challenges very seriously, and we are trying to be responsive to members' emerging needs as well.
I think one of the things also is that accountants are very likely to be dealing with people in really emotional states themselves, if they're customer facing, if they're dealing with small businesses that are really pressured at the moment. They're likely to be dealing with a customer base that are very emotionally charged and very upset, and they're likely to provide, you know, some support with that, and they need support to manage that themselves. Which I guess is something that might very well arise as we go through this crisis, that more and more of their clients will be really distressed about what this means to them, and the first place they might turn to is their accountant to help them with that, and you know, accountants are then dealing with some of the emotional overload from that. Yeah.
But the recent survey started to look at and explored some of the challenges within the workplace, particularly around lack of career progression. As a newly qualified accountant, how have you seen the world changing? How have things affected you?
I think there's two answers to this. Firstly, on a personal level, I've seen change. I've seen what employers are looking for, especially just even something as basic as how the job recruitment's done now. You know, all your interviews are virtual, predominantly virtual, and then you eventually meet someone. And I think that adds a new layer of, I guess, I don't know if it's comfort, but stress, I would say. It's not really comfort because you're in your own home, but it just doesn't feel the same way. You can't evaluate the other side and expression. That human interaction is really minimized, and COVID hasn't helped, cost of living hasn't helped. And I think another thing I feel about career progression is recently, my friend had a baby, and he's 1 year old now. And she feels like the finance industry is quite hard to progress in. And that's because you just can't strike the balance as a working mother and a professional who cares about career. Well, you must care to get through those exams. You must care a lot, and you've invested a lot. But as time moves on, and I was talking to her recently, and I've come to find that, you know, despite there being this shared parental leave, extended parental leave, eventually there's a lot of pressure to choose. You kind of have to settle. Women tend to, I think, more so than men, go into part-time working, and I think that has some emotional and mental health impact, just because you feel like you're always compromising on something, whether it's a house life or it's a professional life. And I think whilst having a supporting partner can help, I think you feel that career progression is reduced, because if you're working part-time, you may feel like you're not giving it your all, and you've studied and worked really hard all these years to get to wherever you are, and then to let that go. But then if you're not doing that, then you're compromising maybe your family values and, you know, the whole bliss stage of being a parent, I guess. And you're always compromising on something. And I think and what comes at the cost of that is your career. So I think career progression isn't just, you know, is your employer offering you opportunities? It's whether your life is offering you that opportunity. And I think that's exactly where Caba comes in, because one of the services we have is about the mental health. And I think here there's a lot of mental health on the burnout element, on the career progression element, on feeling like of compromise, and I'm losing something. You know, you're losing a bit of yourself. And I think if you talk to someone and you talk to them and you just say this, look, I'm feeling this way, what can I do? I think that conversation is maybe easier with a stranger, because, you know, they can't judge you, and even if they do, you're not going to know.
And as primary caregiving with children, of course, but also for a lot of us parents as well, it becomes a challenging personal life as well as a challenging professional life, and balancing that quite tough in this environment. And
that's what causes this burnout, I guess, predominantly, because it's not just the jobs are demanding, regardless of where you work. You can work for even you can work for a charity, and it's still very demanding. But then if you feel like you're compromising that with your sense of self, which does come from the people in your life, the choices you make in your life outside your job, I think it just causes a lot of, coming back to the point on self-worth, it causes you to question your self-worth and where you kind of derive your self-worth from.
I think you make a really interesting point in terms of burnout, because we know that burnout is a process. It just doesn't happen on one day, and it's a multifactorial process that needs different people to come together to help someone. So we know that the definition is it's a occupational phenomena. We also know that it potentially affects people who are perfectionistic, who show great conscientiousness in their work, who, when work gets busy, they start to ignore their own well-being needs because they place all the importance on the values at work. So we do need a variety of agencies to come together to help, really, and looking at your own psychological makeup and the pressure that you put on yourself and what your values are. But going back to the organisation, as it is an occupational phenomena, they really need to also take responsibility to manage people's workloads effectively, to manage the psychosocial risk factors at work, to give people the resources they need, to look at people's lives from a holistic point of view and think, where is this person in their life and what pressures are they dealing with, and how can we be flexible to keep them where they want to be without compromising too much of their own family values. So, you know, the organisation needs a structure and a processes in place, really, to manage those risk factors that often impact on our mental health. But it's a great point about the fact that it is a multifactorial issue.
Exactly, yeah. And I think career progression is not just one thing.
I love your phrase that opportunity is created by your employer, but also by the opportunities that life brings you as well, and that combination of both. And managing burnout becomes quite important. Burnout only affects professions that are involved with people. And although we see ourselves as a numbers profession, we're a people profession as well, and being able to say no and being able to manage upwards, just as important as skills to managing our own mental health and trying to prevent burnout.
I think that's a common misconception about accountants, while you raise that point, because it's not just numbers. A lot of people, when I tell them, like, oh, I'm an accountant, they're like, you must be good at numbers. I'm like, that's not all I do. It's a lot of people skill you need to be, you know, in this for the long run. And for people, you need to understand the emotion and psychology, all the makeup that goes with it.
Equipping ourselves with the technical skills and the people skills, the softer skills become really important, being a rounded profession and trying to look after ourselves through quite a demanding and challenging career.
Exactly.
Kirsty, the current media uses an awful lot of loaded language, crisis, recession. How do we protect ourselves, and how do we maintain our well-being when the language is so loaded, when the language is so dramatic?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. Language is so important because it shapes our perception of the world. It shapes our imagination as to what's coming to us at any one point in time. It shapes our perception of our standing in the world. And of course, the press and the media are constantly trying to hook our attention by the most inflammatory language that they can, because they know that that's what will hook our attention, because we do have this negative bias that we're always searching into the environment for anything that we might consider threatening, and social threat and financial threat are very prevalent. So I think it's being aware of what you're taking in on a regular basis, whether that be through the news or the social media channels that you frequent, and giving yourself a break from them, recognising how they're affecting your mood, and, you know, getting your information from credible sources. I mean, as Paul said, we want to be aware of useful things we can do for ourselves, and much of that information will come from social media and the internet. But it's just recognising where to go and to give yourself a break. I think one of the things about anxiety, we often think if we get more and more information, we'll solve the way that we feel. But all we do is overload ourselves with more information, and that makes us more confused. And I think the second point to remember is not only that the language that you see around you, but being really aware of how you're speaking to yourself, because, you know, the brain is kind of registering any threat externally, but it's also registering internal threat. And what can happen when we're stressed and when things are difficult is we can fall back onto harsh self-criticism to motivate us through this difficult period. And actually, that's not really helpful if you've got difficulties in your life and then you're berating yourself for being a failure, for you know, not being as good as everybody else, for not being in your career where everyone else is. So really important to tune into how you're speaking to yourself and recognize that that is potentially also firing up your threat system. And just ask yourself the question, really, if you're going to go through a tough time, do you want to go through it with a harsh inner critic, or do you want to go through it being your own ally? You know, being the most supportive you can to yourself. Yeah.
Difficult to achieve.
Yeah.
Negative thoughts, worries can self-reinforce and can build. What practical advice could you give somebody who was struggling with negative thinking and negative thoughts, negative self-worth and worries?
I think to go back to basics, the first thing to think about is, you know, Mark talked about physical health in terms of eating well, getting sleep when you can, making sure you have rest periods through the day, so micro rest periods, and then also protecting your space at the weekend or days that you've got off. You know, because we know that the condition of our physical body affects the way our mind processes information, and that can make those negative thoughts worse if we've had a bad night's sleep, or we've not eaten properly, or we're not drinking adequate water. So start with the basics. And anxiety's job is to propel you into the future, into a fairly catastrophic view of the future, and one that you won't be able to cope with. That's what anxiety does. So it's really pulling yourself back, making sure you rein in your imagination and stick with what you know. Recognize when you're beginning to assume things, because we get into this pattern of mind reading. We think we know what's going to happen. Stick with what's in front of you. Stick with the facts. Recognize when you're beginning to assume. So choosing activities that anchor you into what you're doing in present moment reality is helpful.
Thank you. And Mark, if you can't do what Kirsty's suggesting, you can't look after yourself, when do you need to talk to somebody else?
As soon as possible is the quickest answer. And the difficulty there is if you are in a period of self-doubt, negative thought, you're probably going to be quite critical on yourself and therefore not going to want to expose that to somebody else. And the encouragement is just to go and talk, and whatever shape that takes, starting that initial conversation. And I think one thing that worries me is we talk about the working environment. That's great. You've got an employer around you, you've got people around you. One of the things that worries me more is the sort of older person who's maybe more of my generation and who traditionally wouldn't want to talk about mental health problems. It wasn't there and out in the open. We're in a society today where it's really good to speak about anxiety, about mood, about all of these impacts. But what worries me is that generation that maybe didn't want to talk, didn't want to open up, and how we encourage people to step forward where you maybe don't have that social network, just to have that conversation and just reach out really to see what is available. Because what worries me in that sense of going, well, you know, if I'm not comfortable stepping forward and saying I've got these feelings, I'm feeling really low, I'm feeling in this way, we can't begin to start that process of assistance or self-help. So really it's encouraging conversations to take place, and even within people who've got older parents, having those conversations with their parents about, you know, is everything okay? And you'll often pick that up in terms of families where somebody's disengaging or maybe, you know, they were coping really well and then suddenly you're visiting and thinking actually things aren't looking as good as they were. So actually speaking up on somebody else's behalf is also a really powerful thing, but being really careful with that as well and not doing it behind someone's back, so it's not a surprise that suddenly somebody's phoning up wanting to talk to you, but do you mind if I share this with somebody who I think might be able to help you, is a good way to start that conversation. So I think it's just making sure that we are having conversations about how we're feeling as regularly as we can and across a wide range of age groups as well. So we encourage everybody to start talking.
I think
Yeah, I think, going back to what we just said about language, and we hear a lot of language about mental ill health tsunami, mental health problems, and I just wonder whether that frightens people to come forward because they don't see themselves as a person who is experiencing mental health problems. And I think, in terms of another way to phrase it, what we are experiencing is an understandable increase in emotional distress due to life factors or socioeconomic factors that are completely out of our control. So I think sometimes phrasing it like that helps people to understand that what they're feeling is actually normal in relation to what they're experiencing. It doesn't mean to say that they've got a mental health illness or they'll have a mental health diagnosis. I know there's lots of research to say, especially young people, they're reticent to come forward about their mood because they feel that it's going to be diagnosed very quickly, and that's not something that they initially want to explore. So I think we also need to frame it in what we're all experiencing is understandable distress. That doesn't mean to say that we don't need help with that at times, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're unwell or ill or will necessarily end up with a diagnosis. Some people might, but a lot of people just need that listening ear, practical steps forward, and to be in an environment which they feel supported. Yeah.
I think to follow on from what both Mark and Kirsty have said, here at Caba we are actually seeing more and more younger people. So we're seeing ACA students, newly qualified members. This tends to be the age group that is contacting us about emotional health support. And there is something of a generational divide in terms of who feels comfortable contacting us. Because I think it's important to call back to what we said about the financial situation. Emotional health doesn't discriminate either. It doesn't matter what age group, how old you are. People of all ages will be feeling and experiencing this. And I think perhaps it's worth reflecting on our client base, the accountancy community. I think those older members have almost been conditioned to not to talk about it, to keep it hidden, to keep it under wraps. That in some way, emotional health, mental health, these topics are a weakness in some ways. And I think it's almost a tragedy that there is a generation of accountants out there who are going through this, who are suffering, who have the opportunity to have some support through Caba, but unfortunately don't feel comfortable in reaching out to us. And it's our job, and that's part of the reason why we're here, is to raise that awareness, to encourage people of all age groups to come forward to us and access our support services.
I think one way to look at this is, I think coming back to the point you raised, Kirsty, about anxiety is, if I was to say something hurtful to someone, either they will stop me because I've said something, or someone will hear it and they will stop me. If I hear a friend say something hurtful about themselves, I will stop them because I'm listening. But when it comes to ourselves, where I am saying hurtful things to myself, there's no one in the middle to tell me, hey, this is hurtful, or this is mean, or this is, self-depreciating. And I think that is, if we recognize that if I can't say something mean to someone else, why can I say that to myself? And if we ask ourselves whenever we have these thoughts that you are, I don't know, you're stupid, or you're whatever you call yourself, the words you use, it's like, can I say this to someone else? Will I get away with it? If the answer is no, then why am I saying this to myself? And why am I letting myself get away with it, even though there's no third person listening into this conversation? It's a lot of self-regulation, and then I think that will sort of bring down the anxiety that a lot of people get because they're constantly hearing themselves. And when you're hearing yourself in only your own voice, I don't know what's going on in your head, but if you're telling yourself all of this, then it's going to affect you, and it's going to affect every aspect of your life, but you won't know it because there's no person to stop that happening.
We all have mental health, as we all have physical health, good and bad, and it varies from time to time. Following this conversation, perhaps time to throw away the stiff upper lip and embrace the slogan, or embrace the phrase, it's good to talk. always reminded of the adage, a problem shared is a problem halved, and some of the research around burnout is conversations around stress and burnout give the hope that it may be addressed, and in that way starts the process of normalising where you are.
Yeah, I think if we're going to give the people message that it's good to talk, we also need to learn to listen. So it's good to talk to someone who listens and who you feel safe with and who you have an inkling will respond in a way that will be compassionate and, including yourself. Yeah.
And I guess not everybody is fortunate to work for a large organisation with a lot of infrastructure. If you're retired or you're unemployed or you've changed careers or you're working for a smaller firm, you probably don't have a lot of that infrastructure around. Paul, is Caba the sort of organisation that you can just phone up and say, look, I think I might need some help?
Absolutely, unequivocally, yes. Regardless of whatever position you're in, as you said, if someone may be unemployed, someone may be retired, we also assist a lot of people perhaps who are outside of the accountancy field now, moved out of the community. Such a diverse, broad range of people and such a broad, diverse range of issues. And we're here to support people. And as has been alluded to by my fellow panellists, we're certainly not here to make you judge, because we know that being in these positions, being in financial difficulty, experiencing emotional health challenges, it feels awful enough already. So the last thing we want to do is to add to that. We're here to support, to empower, and to give you a safe space just to talk. And as Tuba alluded to, it's not necessarily a quick fix. You can't phone up and then tomorrow that's it all goes away. But so many people after that initial conversation with me have said to me, do you know what? I feel so much better. I wish I'd done this sooner. And that's a recurring theme we hear again and again and again.
Thank you. Kirsty, we talk about helping ourselves through the crisis, keeping on top of our own mental health. How does somebody know when it's time to talk to somebody professional?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. That there isn't an absolute point we're all on a continuum of mental health, ill health, poor mental health, and we slide up and down that on a daily, regular basis, dependent on what's happening to us, what resources we've got. And people often ask me, when is that definitive time? And it's difficult to just put a line in the sand, but in general, I would say if your ability to function in the way that you generally or typically did is starting to erode, if your coping mechanisms aren't being as helpful for you as they may have been, if despite your best efforts to talk to family and friends and do some things for yourself, you still feel distressed, if your ability to manage your anxiety is eroding as well, if things are beginning to get more painful for you and you just notice that you're not functioning, then that's likely the time generally that it would be best to reach out for some professional help. Of course, the GP is the primary care provider, so either making an appointment with the GP or Caba offers professional therapy and coaching as well. And I guess just to be realistic and transparent, GPs are having difficulties at the moment because of a reduced workforce. They're busy, they're still catching up with the pandemic. So if you don't feel that you've been successful on the first go, as Mark alluded to, keep trying, maybe elicit the support of a friend or a family member, but don't give up if you don't get the answer that you need on the first go. Variety of sources, but your GP is your primary care provider, but just be aware they are struggling, and to just keep persevering. Yeah.
I think also an employer's got a role to play. We talked about the sort of employee assistance programs and what help you might be able to get. And Kirsty picks up a point that I think we are seeing more and more, where somebody's got an identified need, they go to the GP, and then you've got a waiting list. And actually, you need that help now. It's identified. So GP's done their job. Brilliant. You're on a waiting list, but 8 weeks, 12 weeks to get to see somebody to talk about what is recognised as an issue. So we always encourage people, Obviously, if they're coming to us, but actually go and see what your employer can offer as well, because it could be there's a confidential line that you could. It doesn't replace what you might be on the waiting list for, but might keep the conversation going. So by the time you get to your therapy, actually you feel in a better place to be able to verbalise it, to be able to have a more detailed conversation. So it really is trying to find, we can't create a lot of services to catch up with where we are behind in terms of waiting lists, in terms of all of that and that impact, which is also waiting lists for physical health issues as well. But just reach out and see what is available, have that conversation, because I think the main thing is to get some form of intervention in as quickly as possible, and especially if somebody's been to a GP and they know there's an issue, but there is a wait, and we are trying and we are looking at models in which we may be able to support people either through talking therapies or just putting them in touch with someone to have that conversation in the interim.
One final question for the panel. The cost of living crisis is likely to be impacting us for the foreseeable future, and we have the spectre of recession. So these are future worries. The survey talked about people's anxieties and accountants' anxieties about what might happen tomorrow. What advice would you give somebody to help them maintain good mental health with the spectre of future challenges?
I think investing in the relationship with your employer, and by that I mean your immediate line of whoever you're reporting to, line of reporting. I think that, if anything, is the best way to not only make sure you're sane in the whole process, but the other person trusts you. Because sometimes what happens is if you're stressed, you can withdraw. And when you withdraw, you might miss things. But if someone doesn't know you're withdrawing, and also that's not also visible, some people are naturally more quiet, some people are more talkative, so it's not always apparent. And I think if you don't build that relationship with your immediate line manager and your colleagues, immediate colleagues, I think if you don't allow them to see your indicators, then you're going to suffer not just internally, the storm you're in, but also their work's going to suffer. And I think if someone doesn't know what you're feeling, they're not only are they not able to help you, but they cannot know that whatever you're not doing, it's because of XYZ reason, not just because you're lazy or you're not good at your job or you're not competent. So I think having good bosses and having good relationship with the good bosses, I think that it's a two-way relationship, and I think it helps everything.
Worrying about the things that you can control and not worrying about the things that you can't control.
And
really
I think that's the biggest thing for stopping a burnout and anxiety. It's defining what is controllable and what is not controllable. And by controllable, it's not that this can be managed through external, but it's actually what can you do? What can you do? You can only talk to someone. You can only contact Caba or Sanitarians or whoever. You can only do that. That doesn't mean the problem will be fixed, and just remembering that, okay, maybe I've spoken to someone, maybe I've seen someone, maybe I've seen the GP, my problem's not sorting out, but that's okay. Some problems do take time, and I think you just have to give some time, and let it unravel, and not be too hard on yourself in all this.
I think following on from that, when we feel very anxious, we can get caught in this freeze like rabbit in the headlights, and we can think, well, I can't do anything to support myself until this big situation I'm dealing with is over. And for me, it's more about walking alongside the difficulty and recognising that it is there. Likely it's going to be there for, quite a while yet. So how can I, as best as I can with the resources I have, how can I keep doing the things that bring me pleasure? How can I keep supporting my well-being? How can I find ways to relax, wind down, whilst I'm walking alongside this massive difficulty? I think sometimes we get into this black and white thinking, I can't do anything nice for myself until I've absolutely sorted this out. And that's the anxious brain talking, really. Everything is your fault, everything's your responsibility. The more stress we've got in life, the more we need to invest in the things that will give us just that tiny sense of balance. And that's something we can feel guilty about, because people often say to me in therapy, I feel really guilty about going out for a coffee. I'm supposed to be really sad about this. But, feelings undulate. And I think the other thing to remember is, everything changes. So beware headlines that are pulling you into this catastrophic view of the future when actually none of us actually know. We might have a good idea, but we don't actually know what is going to happen. And if you look over the spectre of history over the last 100 years, there have been many, many difficulties that we've encountered as a human race, and we have actually come through them. They've taken a while, they are painful. Look at the pandemic and where we were 2 years ago. Okay, we're still in it to some extent, but we are a lot further along the line. So things may not get better initially, and it might be very difficult, and don't dismiss that. But remember that eventually things do shift around and they do change, because I think we've all got a responsibility to keep that hope open for each other, because it's quickly lost, really, and we really don't know what's going to happen.
Thank you. I think on a practical sense, where we think we know where things are going, and we are being fed that things are going to change. Sometimes I think it's about just taking measured steps, so understanding what your incomings and outgoings are. We've seen a huge rise in people in the first 2 quarters of this year putting expenses onto credit cards. So already you're giving yourself an extra financial burden. So it's looking at how you do things, making sure that you're aware of what you've got coming in, what you've got going out, and what control you can have. And for me as well, it's looking at what's out there that doesn't always cost something. So what's good for your mental health and sometimes your physical health is just go and walk in the woods, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Actually doesn't cost you anything, but will give you a sense of just a grounding, a sense to talk to yourself, to kind of rationalise. It's really difficult to get angry in the woods. Don't know why, but actually it has a very calming effect on people. So there are many things that you can do that don't cost, and just thinking about how you might, if things panned out, how's it going to look, what's it going to look like, almost give yourself the ability to look into the future and kind of see what it looks like in control.
And you don't have to do it all yourself.
No.
Caba has a range of experts and knowledge to help you understand what you can do, what we can do, and what others can do.
I think that's the point, is what we may not be able to do, we will know somebody who will be able to support you. So I think that's the other thing, is that we won't sit here and say we're the experts at everything. As Paul alluded to, we're trying to model our provision to meet emerging needs. And at this precise moment, that's quite a challenge, because there are quite a few emerging needs that we might not even have predicted. But it is about understanding we can't be everything to everybody, but if we've got that good signposting and we can point you in the right direction, actually we can begin to be the listening ear of that initial conversation that opens the further doors.
Thank you to our panel for your insight, your advice, and your contributions. Thank you for being so candid.